shadows, voices rose, brave and quiet, and no one knows. Fighting not with fame or pride, but for freedom side by side. Holland's hidden heroes, standing strong and true. In the darkest hours, they lit a path through. Their stories lost, but not for long. We sing their names, we pass it on. Heroes hand in hand.
Welcome to Holland's Hidden Heroes, the podcast where amazing stories from the Dutch history come to life. In every episode, you hear about real people who made brave choices during scary and difficult times. I'm Lillian, and with me is my brilliant 11-year-old co-host Colin. Our very first story is packed with courage, clever thinking, and a fight for freedom. So get on board, fasten your seatbelt, and fly with us through the history of the England Voyagers of the Royal Dutch Airlines. Our first episode on Holland's Hidden Heroes, Colin. I'm quite excited about it, but before we dive into history, perhaps we should introduce ourselves first. Would you like to give it a go?
Hi, thank you Lillian for the introduction. I'm Colin, as you already heard. I'm 11 years old. My hobbies are playing games, and especially games such as The Sims 4, Minecraft, and Mario games. I have a PlayStation 5 at home, and I have a Nintendo Switch at home, and I also like drawing, but I'm just not really good at it, but I just like doing it. And I live in Almere, in a city pretty near Amsterdam.
I live in Almere, and I work at a local government where I am a project manager and have been responsible for the recovery of a shot Sterling bomber from the Second World War. Where we also find human remains of a British and Canadian crew. And that really got me interested in the stories from the Second World War, and especially stories where we work together with other countries in finally to defeat the Nazi Germans. And that's how I got excited about, especially about working together with Colin, my co-host, who is my nephew, by the way, and where I'm very proud of. As you guys might have heard, English is not our first language. We're both Dutch, but we think the stories are so important that they shouldn't be forgotten, and they still matter today, so we really like to share it with the world, and that's why we're doing the podcast in English. And why do you like to make the podcast, Colin?
Well, our topic at school last year was war, so I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know about it. But now I know, so that's why, and I wanted to share some stories.
Yeah, you like making it in English?
Yes, because next year when I'm at
You're going to high school next year?
Yeah. Half of my classes are going to be in Dutch, and the other half is going to be in English, so that's why I'm practicing now.
Oh, that's very cool. That's very cool. So let's see where we're gonna get with this story, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive in some history, Dutch history about the Second World War. I think it's best to say on forehand, if we speak about Germans in the past, we're referring to the Nazi Germans and not to the Germans today, because they're totally different people with different beliefs and different opinions. And Colin, you just said that you learned about it, about the Second World War at school. Can you tell a bit about it?
The Netherlands was occupied for 5 years in World War II from 1940 to 1945. We were liberated by the British, Canadians, Americans, and a lot of others.
Yeah, and they were very rough years, those 5 years, because the Dutch weren't free anymore. So you couldn't express your opinions freely. There were books you weren't supposed to read. There was a lot of people taken from the country, especially men, to put to work somewhere else. It was very, very, very tough, actually. And when the Germans invaded us, our government had to flee to England. So they went to London and they held office there. So our government and our queen, which was Wilhelmina back then, they had an office in London. And there were a lot of other countries who had that too. But I think it's very important to know that our government tried to govern in exile. And that means that they tried to help the Dutch, but from a distance, because they weren't in the country anymore. And what is interesting, that they tried to motivate the Dutch to hold on, to know there was still hope. But it was very different time back then in communicating, because we didn't have Wi-Fi, no internet, as you might know, Colin. So that's perhaps a bit depressing. No, or not?
Yeah. I can't live without devices now.
No, but they didn't know any better. But how did the government still contact the people? They had to do it secretly, or else the Germans would see that there was a message, or there was mail, or anything. But they also broadcasted through radio, and that radio was called Radio Oranje, Radio Orange, and that refers to one of the last names of our royals. So that's why the Dutch are always associated with a lot of orange. And that radio used the BBC, and they broadcasted every night at 8:15 for 15 minutes, where they told the Dutch to hold on. So the Dutch weren't allowed to listen to any radio others than what the Germans described them to, so it was all done very secretly. But it did help to have a little bit of communication. So you still have a great-grandmother, old granny, as you.
Yeah.
So she's my grandmother, but she's your great-grandmother, the only one that's still alive. She's turning 95 by the end of this month. So pretty old, but she lived in the war. She was 10, almost 11 when the war broke out, so she was your age, and it lasted for 5 years. So that had a huge impact on her life. Well, she also lived in the hunger winter. I think there was something at school for you too about the hunger winter, wasn't it?
There was no heater, no fuel, no power, and worst of them all, no food. And it was very, very cold that winter. People were going crazy, so they started to eat tulip bulbs, wallpaper paste, and almost everything.
Yeah, there were a lot of people who also tried to get to farmland to find some food there, but it became even more expensive. And it was very, very difficult to travel in the country and not being caught by the Germans. So it were very dangerous times. And your great-grandmother ate mostly tulip bulbs. So she told me that her mother tried to make soup or a sort of stew by the tulip bulbs, but because there was no heating, it was very difficult to cook something. And it tasted disgusting. It was very, very bitter, and it was the only food they had. So they were very, very happy. She lived in Amsterdam. When the Allies came, and they threw all sorts of food out of the sky, when they sent all the aircraft with loads and loads of food from Britain, also from the Americans, and that has saved a million of Dutch. That could be an interesting other podcast, by the way. So living under the occupation in the Netherlands was very, very hard, and people didn't really have a choice. But there was numbers of people who couldn't accept their fate and wanted to fight against the Nazi Germans, the resistance fighters. And recent study has showed that over 1 million people were in the resistance. And back then we had like 9 million Dutch people, so that's a lot. And it weren't just people who joined resistance groups, because we had those too who joined them, who carried and smuggled guns, who gathered all sorts of information like maps from the area which they shared with the Allied forces. But there were also many individual resistance fighters who helped out people in hiding, like Jews, but also people who escaped from the Germans and Allied pilots to make sure they could get back to Britain. They helped out children from different kind of families. And all this resistant jobs or different kind of tasks they carried out all helped in fighting off the Nazi Germans. But there was also a special group within the resistance fighters, the so-called England Voyagers. And I believe, Colin, you did some research about the England Voyagers. Could you share a bit more about it?
An England Voyager, or in Dutch England Voyager, was someone from the Netherlands who escaped from occupied territory during World War II to travel to England. Their goal was to join the Allies and help in the fight against Nazi Germany.
Yeah, and it started as a nickname during the war, but after the war it became an official Dutch name of honor. It was given by the government, and people also got the medals and all the credits they deserve for carrying it out. But perhaps, Colin, you can share a bit on how they traveled. Which route did they take?
The England Voyagers escaped from Nazi-occupied Netherlands in various ways to reach England. Some crossed the North Sea in small boats, which was very dangerous due to storms and German patrols. Others traveled overland through countries like Belgium, France, Spain, Switzerland, or Sweden, often using fake papers and the help from resistance groups. A few hid in ships or trucks, or traveled via neutral countries such as Spain, Portugal, or Sweden. But there were also a lot of risks, such as if they were caught, they faced imprisonment, deportation to concentration camps like Buchenwald, or even execution. Many attempts failed, but around 1,700 people succeeded in reaching England between 1940 and 1944. Their escapes were extremely dangerous, but their bravery is still honored today.
Yeah, can you imagine that? That you are in occupied Netherlands, which is a danger on its own, and then you have to travel to Britain and you have to go to all these dangerous war areas, other countries, where there's fighting, where there's occupation, and it's very difficult to get there. So the England voyages had a very dangerous route to undertake. So it was already brave just to go to Britain and face all the dangers. But when they got there, they were either hired by the Dutch government or one of the Allied governments, and they carried out different kind of jobs. And you can share more about that, Colin, can't you?
The England Voyagers took on important roles in England to help the Allies. Many became soldiers, often in the Princess Irene Brigade, the Navy, or the Air Force. Some worked as secret agents, returning to the Netherlands to spy, sabotage, or support the resistance. Others served as pilots or aircrew in the British Royal Air Force, RAF. Some were radio operators or code specialists, keeping contact with the resistance. Others worked in support roles like intelligence or the Dutch government in exile.
There's one very interesting England voyager. Her name was Trix Terwindt. Trix worked as an air hostess at the Royal Dutch Airlines, the KLM. And it was very special back in those days because it was a new job. We didn't have any air hostesses before because women weren't allowed to fly. They considered it to be too dangerous and they should stay at home and not be up in the air. So when she applied for the first of the air hostess jobs in 1935, she was very excited. And it's very difficult to work in the aviation back then because the planes weren't as sophisticated as they are now, and it was a lot of dangers. Many of the aircraft got lost, were broken in the air, crashed. So it was a dangerous job. I think we can learn more about it later. And then in 1940 the war broke out. And she found it very, very difficult to accept the German occupation. And she decided she wanted to fight them. So she started as a resistance fighter in the Netherlands, where she wanted to help Allied pilots that had crashed in the Netherlands and needed to get back to Britain. But it was very difficult because we didn't have any escape lines back then to know who to trust. So she felt she couldn't do as much as she wanted to do, and she decided she wanted to go to Britain to fight the enemy from there. And that's where her journey has started. So she took off in the Netherlands and she undertook, together with a Dutch cadet who needed to flee because or else he would have been executed. She fled and made it to Switzerland, which was a neutral country. It was very dangerous on the way, so she needed to walk through the mountains. She needed to make sure the Germans couldn't find her. They had fake papers when they sat in the train. And finally, when she made it to Switzerland, the Swiss authorities imprisoned her. So she stayed in prison there because they didn't want to let her go through. But she was so determined that she made sure that her contacts with the KLM helped her out to get proper papers, so it would seem she would travel through another country, not to Britain. So she had fake papers, and in the end, she made it again when she was released from the prison, and she got to Portugal. And from there, because the KLM had an airplane that still flew from Portugal to England, she was able to get on a plane and land in Bristol. And she was so happy. It took her half a year to get from the Netherlands to London. And she thought, okay, I'm finally ready to fight against the Nazi Germans. But again, she had to face a setback, as she was first interrogated by the Patriotic School. And Colin, can you share a bit more what the Patriotic School was?
The Patriotic School was like a checkpoint where they made sure new escapees like Trix were who they said they were and weren't spies. Only after passing this check could they start secret missions or other underground work.
And after that, after Patriotic School was ready, she was again interrogated by the Dutch government. So you can imagine when arriving in London that you're not very happy that you have to undergo all that, even though it's very understandable that the Brits didn't want to work with any spies, so they need to check that very carefully. And because our government was in exile in London and our Queen was there, our Queen met with every England Voyager that came along. And there was a sort of clubhouse in London called Oranjehaven, which translates Orange Haven, which was a sort of safe haven for all the Dutch where they could gather and meet with one another and hopefully hear more about how things were going in the Netherlands and with their families. So Trix also was there, and she met with several other colleagues from the KLM Airlines. And this I thought was very interesting, because she wasn't the only England Voyager that came from the Royal Dutch Airlines. So there were more from KLM who made it to Britain. And she wanted to take action. She didn't want to take an office job or work in administration. She very much wanted to fight directly against the Nazi Germans. And then she was recruited by Harry Neave. Now, Harry Neave is not very well known in the Netherlands, but he is in Britain. He was a brave and clever soldier from Britain who played an important role during the Second World War. Harry Neave was captured and sent to a very scary prison called Coldis Castle, a place where it's almost impossible to escape. But he wasn't just brave, he was also very smart, so he managed to escape anyway. And he made it back to Britain. So after that, he joined the MI9, one of the British Secret Service, and he worked for Department Room 900, which is a very, very secretive department. And they were there to help soldiers who got stuck behind enemy lines. And it was his job to come up with clever ways to help prisoners of war escape or pilots that were crashed and make sure they got home safely. So he needed to set up escape lines in different countries. And he wanted to set up one in the Netherlands. And he could really use Trix's help in doing that. But before coming a secret agent, she had to undergo a very strict training. And this training wasn't easy. And Colin, you have looked into the spy training, what it was like back then.
Spy training in World War II was tough and secret. Agents learned physical skills like parachuting and fighting, plus spying skills such as secret writing, radio use, and disguises. They practiced coding messages, acting, and blending into enemy territory. Mental training prepared them for stress, capture, and danger. Overall, it was intense and designed to make them brave, smart, and ready to risk everything.
And when she finished her training, which also took weeks, she was parachuted back in the Netherlands. But she was very unlucky because her whole mission of getting back to the Netherlands was compromised. The Germans already knew that the secret agents was gonna land in the Netherlands. So instead, when she landed, she was supposed to meet resistance fighters, but they were actually Germans and some Dutch who worked for the Germans. So when she landed, she first thought, okay, I'm safe, I'm with resistance fighters. But it turned out a whole other way, and she was imprisoned first in the Netherlands, but later she was sent to 2 different kind of concentration camps, which is one of the worst places to be. And she had to endure many dangerous and difficult situations. But when the war came to an end, she was lucky to have survived it. After the war, she was rewarded multiple medals for all the bravery she had shown.
This is an incredible story. I wonder who those other KLM colleagues were. And I think working at KLM helped them escape to England because they had useful info, contacts, and spoke multiple languages. But escaping was still very risky for everyone, including KLM staff, so it helped but didn't guarantee a safe trip.
No, you're so very right. And I think it will be interesting to find out who were those other colleagues and what were their experiences. So perhaps we should do a little bit more research. Could be interesting to see through their eyes. What was it like to work at KLM at that time? Because we know it was dangerous, because flying was way different than it is now, but I don't think we have a clear image yet on how that was. So we can do some research by books, by the internet. We have a big national archives which has a lot of information on England Voyagers, but I think you're pulling a face like it's a bit boring, but I think we can also do a field trip. How do you like that?
I think we should go to Aviodrome. Aviodrome is a cool airplane museum in the Netherlands where you can see old planes, try flight simulators, and learn about the history of flying. There's even a replica of the Schiphol building from the 1920s. Schiphol is our biggest airport in Amsterdam.
I think it will be a great starting point. And after our visit, we can decide which other heroes from the KLM we like to dive into and see what stories they've got. Thank you for listening to our first episodes. The next episode we will continue our story about the England Voyagers of the Royal Dutch Airlines. One hidden hero at a time.
Holland's hidden hero, standing strong and true.